Hi everyone, in this tutorial I will teach you how to create realistic landscapes with my landscape material. Landscapes are important because they are everywhere. You are always looking at a landscape, which is why I'm making my landscape material completely free. You can download it right now, link in the description below. The features of this landscape material include Nanite displacement, so you can leverage the power of Nanite to add near infinite detail. Height stamps, to quickly create realistic landscapes directly in Unreal without sculpting or using another program. Auto texturing, which applies different textures depending on the landscape's slope. Cell bombing, which can hide repetition in any texture with one click. Virtual texture blending, which will blend any object automatically to the landscape, giving it that extra boost of realism. Procedural foliage placement, so we don't have to manually paint foliage. We can have the material do most of the heavy lifting. And triplanar projection, to hide texture stretching. And all this is easily customizable, so you can make your own version of this material. This is the ultimate landscape creator for Unreal Engine 5. For the rest of this tutorial, I will cover all the features in depth, so you know exactly how to use this material for your own projects. You'll be up and running in no time, creating amazing landscapes. So let's jump into it. This is what you're going to see when you open up the project for the first time. Now, it is important that after you download the project, make sure you unzip it, because if you don't unzip it, you won't see this level, and your content folder will be completely empty. So after you unzip it and you open up the project, this is the first level you're going to see, which is this massive mountain. This mountain is a simple example of how to use the landscape material. And if we go into the outliner, double click on the mannequin, here we have a human as reference for the landscape. So generally, whenever I'm creating a landscape, I like to add in a human just to know what the scale is. So that's how we're able to tell that this mountain is pretty large. Now let's jump into the landscape material and go over some of the basic settings. Now, if you are new to Unreal, I recommend you first watch the UE5 starter course before continuing this video, because otherwise you will be lost. I do assume that you know the basics of Unreal. So to jump into the landscape material, select the landscape, and then within the details panel, double click on landscape material right here. And this is what it is going to open up. Right here in the details panel is all the different parameters we have access to change the landscape material to our liking. Now, this preview is pretty useless. So what I like to do is I like to undock the details panel by holding down the left mouse button and dragging it out like this. And then I will drag out the rest of the windows off to the side. So that's how I get the details panel right here, ready for me to edit in real time. And now if I make any changes, for example, the tint, let's make this super red, we're able to see those changes within the viewports. So press Ctrl Z, because obviously I don't want that. Another tip, that's how I'm just focusing on the landscape and the parameters of the landscape, is to press F10. So F10 will dock all these windows to the side, and if I ever need those windows again, I can just select them right here or press F10 key to get them back. So first off, just like every landscape in Unreal, the different materials, like the cliffs and the grass, are divided up into layers. So the first layer is the A layer, and we can already see that it is the grass layer. The second layer down here is the B layer, and this has cliffs. The third one is C, which is another grass layer we're not using currently. The next one is a D layer, which is snow. And then we have an E layer, which is empty. And we can see all these layers if we go into the landscape editing mode by clicking up here and selecting landscapes, or the shortcut is Shift and 2 to get it. So within landscape, if I go to paint, we now see all these different layers. So the C material right here is the C layer within the landscape editing mode. And if I want to use this layer, I'm unable to paint it. Unreal will give me a warning saying I need to assign it a landscape layer info. So I can paint B. So let's paint right here. I'm able to paint B, which is the cliff. And I'm able to paint A, which is the default grass, because they already have a layer info assigned to them. So to create a layer info for the C layer, just press on the plus button, and then you want to select weight blended layer normal. So this will create a C layer within this location, that's okay, and press save. So now that we have this layer, if I select C again and paint it down, we see that we get brand new grass. If I zoom in, that grass is different from the default grass. I use the same process for D and E whenever I'm creating layers. But you notice that there is a special layer all the way up here, and that is the auto material layer. And this layer is great Right now, the vast majority of this landscape is just using the auto material. This means that it will automatically assign different layers depending on the slope. So when we have a really sharp slope, like right here, which is this cliff, then it's going to use the cliff material. And when the slope isn't sharp, like right here, it will use grass. And this is all dynamic. So if I go into sculpt, select the sculpt brush, and I start sculpting right here, let me increase the brush size by using the bracket keys. So right bracket key increases it, left bracket key decreases it. I am able to paint, and you'll see that it automatically assigns these layers. And then if I ever, let's say, I don't want cliff right here, I want grass, then I could just go back into paint, go into the grass layer, and then paint the A layer on top of the auto material. So that will override the auto material in case it's not giving you what you want. Let's briefly go over how to create a landscape material instance. So in order to find the master material for this landscape, you want to go into content, landscapes, materials, and then we have two materials. We have m_landscape, which is what this mountain is currently using, and then we have landscape height. This adds nanite displacement, which we're going to go over in just a bit. So let's double click on m_landscape to see it. So our entire landscape is being driven by this graph. Do not worry, you don't have to know exactly what is happening in this graph in order to use this landscape material, because we're using an instance. All we need to know is how to change the parameters of the landscape material, not exactly how the landscape material is created. Now, if you do want to know how to create this material from scratch, you could check out the Unreal Masterclass, which explains all these different parts in detail. To create an easy to use instance of this material is like creating an instance of any other material. It's just to right click on m_landscape and create a material instance. We can call this my landscape. And then if I double click on my landscape, I get all the parameters I can quickly edit, just like in the landscape mountain material. And then to apply that material to a landscape, just select the landscape, and then within the details panel, you can drag your new landscape onto it like this. But I want my original landscape, so I'll press Ctrl and Z to undo that change. Now, the entire reason why we have a landscape material is to bring it into our own projects and use them there. So the way we migrate this landscape material out of the landscape project is to migrate this landscape folder. So the only folder and assets you need to bring into other projects is the landscape folder right here. We don't need the example folder because that's just examples. And we also don't need the Megascan folder because those are assets that are being used by the examples. So in order to copy this landscape into another project, of course, you just have to right click and select migrate. This will only select the landscape folder, which is what we want, and press OK. And then navigate to the content folder of your project and select it. Now, if we go into your own project, you'll see that we have the landscape folder right here and the materials ready to be used by creating a material instance of. Now we know how to get this material into our projects. It's time to go over exactly what these parameters do and how we can customize it to create the landscape that you want. And for this part, to better see the landscape, I'm going to press F11 to make my viewport full screen. So that's how we're just focusing on the level. Now, the first parameters are the A material. And you'll notice that the parameters for one layer, for example, normal, roughness, specular, are the exact same for another layer. So all these parameters just repeat for each layer. So what are the parameters for the layers? First up, we have the texture settings. So this is where we're going to put our color texture, our roughness, or our normal texture. And we will go over how to get those in just a second. These are the three most important settings because they will define exactly what material your layer is. And below that, we have albedo control. So you want to make sure you select this triangle in order to get the controls. And the default for all of them is 1. I've already changed some things. So of course, with saturation, if I bring this up, we get a more saturated layer. And then if I bring this down, we get less saturation. And then if I just do 0, then it is black and white. So I'm going to leave that back at 1.3. Then we have brightness. Obviously, this controls how bright our layer is. Leave that at 1.3. And contrast controls, as you can guess, the contrast. So if I bring this up to 2, then our landscape is looking pretty interesting. So we'll just leave that at 1 for now. And below that is tint. If we want to change the overall color of the layer, then this is where I'm going to do that. So if I want to make this, let's say maybe more like fall, so less green, a little bit more brownish, then I'll change the color to like right here and press OK. So now we have brown grass, and press Ctrl Z to undo that. And then we have normal strength. This one is self-explanatory. It controls the strength of our normal map, which is the shadows of my texture. So instead of 1, we bring it up to 2, actually 10, so that we can better see it. And now we get more noticeable shadows that interact with the lighting. So bring that back to 1 right there. And whenever you want to use a setting, you want to make sure that you activate it first before changing it, because otherwise it'll be grayed out and there will be no change. Roughness is how rough you want the material to be. And roughness is tied with specular strength. So in Unreal, the specular strength by default is 0.5 for all materials. And obviously now you're going to see that we get a weird reflection on the landscape. It's almost like this grass is plastic and not actually grass. So a little tip we do for all our landscape layers is that we bring down this specular strength to something really small like 0.02, and that gives something much more natural. The landscape doesn't feel like plastic anymore. But because we bring it down to 0.02, that means that this roughness doesn't really have much of an effect. But if I did leave it at 0.5, then roughness would control how rough the landscape is. So if I bring it down to 0, then we get an extra shiny landscape. So let's set those back to their default values. And if I ever want to set something back to its default value, I can just click on the reset button right here. So turn that off and normal strength off. And now we have the different blending options. So right now we're not using the blending option for the grass. So let's hop into the cliff to check out the blending options. Right now, the cliff material is using distance blend. Distance blend is a way to hide repetition. And repetition is when our texture is noticeably tiling, which can immediately break immersion. You probably notice this in a lot of video games where you're looking at texture and then you realize, wait, that texture is the same, it's just repeating itself. So if I uncheck this to see what I mean, now you'll notice that, this cliff is very noticeably tiling. Look, we have one texture continually repeating itself. And what distance blend will do is that it will blend in between 2 different sizes of the texture. So we have a really large size of the texture, and then if I zoom in, you'll see it transitions to a smaller size. So we have the really big one, and then when we get closer and closer, it transitions until the texture is smaller. And to change the size of a texture, so we have our normal size, and then we have our far size. If I decrease the sizes, for example, make this 0.005, then the texture is a lot bigger. Or if I increase it to 0.1, then the texture is a lot smaller. So you're going to want to experiment with these values to see which one is better. So at least for this one, a value of 0.01 was good for the far size. And then the size that's up close, I landed on a value of 0.08. If I want this to tile a little bit more when the player is up close to the texture, then I can do 0.1 or even 0.5. But now that transition between the far texture and the near texture is very noticeable. And the start offset and the blend fall off control where the textures transition between each other. So that is one way to hide repetition. Another way to hide repetition is what I'm using on the grass down here. So if I scroll back up to the grass layer, we have cell bombing. So if I turn off cell bombing, now you'll notice that, this is very noticeably texturing. If the player is walking around the landscape, they know that it's just a texture repeating on itself. But then as soon as I turn on cell bombing down here, boom, that texture is immediately removed. What it's doing is that instead of tiling the texture, it is going to randomly scatter that texture around and blend the textures together realistically. So that is another way to hide repetition. The only downside with cell bombing is that when we turn it on, the landscape material's performance decreases. So it might slow down our game. So just keep that in mind when you use cell bombing. You might not want to use it on all your material layers because that can add up. And masks are primarily used with Megascan assets, which we will go over in just a second. So I'm going to skip that, and then we have spec from color, which will vary the specular highlights based on the color texture. This can add a little bit of realistic roughness variation. So generally I like to leave that on. And then we have size. Unlike the cliff material where we have two sizes, we only have one because we're not using distance blend. Again, if I bring this down to something small like 0.1, then our texture increases in size. Or if I bring it up to something like 0.3, then our texture decreases in size. Now, those were all the main parameters for each of the material layers. So the parameters for A material are the same as B and C. Essentially, you're able to customize your landscape exactly how you want with just these simple settings. And there's one more parameter that only applies to the B material, and that's because generally, at least for this landscape material, we will use the B layer as the cliff layer for the auto landscape. And the additional setting for the B layer is triplanar projection. So if I turn this off, you'll see what I mean. And that is we get really bad texture stretching. So whenever we have textures on really sharp angles, those textures are going to stretch. And it's even noticeable right here, where the rocks are stretched going up. And then as soon as I turn on triplanar projection, that will fix the texture stretching to make the landscape a little bit more realistic. So that's an additional setting for the B material. Those are all the settings for the layers. Now let's go over settings that apply to the entire landscape as a whole. So if you make a change there, it won't just apply to one layer, it will be applied to the entire landscape. And you can find those settings all the way down here under the layer settings. And we're going to start off with Z variation at the very bottom. So Z variation is 3 different textures that we're overlaying on top of the landscape to just make it look a little bit more realistic and maybe hide some texture repetition. So we have color variation right here, which is a texture of color splotches overlaid on the landscape. This adds just a little bit of color variation. So right now it's at 0.3. If I bring this up to 1, you will now see those color splotches. So this is too intense. Then I bring it down to something like 0.3. So that's how it's making a little bit of an effect. And below that is macro variation. Macro variation is like the color splotches, except it is black and white. So if I bring this up to 1, you can see that they're just black splotches. That is darkening the landscape. Also bring down to something like 0.3 just to add a little bit of an effect. And then we have a normal variation strength. So this will artificially add shadows to the landscape. So you can see without it and with it. And if the camera gets closer to the landscape, then the variation disappears. So just like beforehand, it doesn't have to be this intense. I find it's just a little bit of normal variation at 0.3 to be pretty good for most landscapes. And of course, you could switch out these textures in case you don't want them. And above that, we now have the slope blend. So this controls the auto material. If I want to increase the angle at which the cliff material is being spawned, then I can increase the fall off amount to something like 3 or even 4 to get a lot more cliffs. Or I could bring it down to 1. That's how only the sharpest of angles has the cliff texture. Or if I think the transition is a little bit too much, then I could increase the angle contrast to something like even 10. So now we have a pretty sharp transition between the two layers. So I'll reset both of them. And if I want to make the transition more realistic, so it's not a smooth transition like this, I could increase the normal blend right here to let's go something like 0.2. And now it is using the normals of the cliff to transition between the two layers. So if you add a little bit of a normal blend, this can make that transition just a tad bit more realistic. So I'll keep it at 0 for now. And let's say if you want a transition material between the grass and the cliff, maybe before the grass transition to cliff, you want it to be dirt in between the two layers. Then we can check extra material blend and it will use the C material right here between the A layer and the B layer. Now, right now, the C material is another grass, so it's hard to tell what is happening. If you are going to transition between grass and cliffs, then I recommend using a dirt material for the C layer. So that is a nice option to have just in case. Above that is foliage. This is for procedural foliage placement. We will go over that later. And then we have ground breakup. Ground breakup is a great way to layer on top of the landscape. a material without having to go into the landscape layers and paint it. So if I turn this on, you'll see that it is currently taking the D material layer, which is snow, and then overlaying it on top of the landscape according to this texture, which we can change. So if you want quick variation between the different material layers without having to paint it, then ground breakup is a good option. And above that, we have height blending. So let's say you have a material and you only want it to spawn at the very top of your landscape or at the very bottom. Then we can either activate top material or bottom material. So they're the same. Let me activate top material, and this will overlay layer D on my landscape at a certain height. So right now, the snow will spawn at a height of, if we go to top material start, 2000. Now I can increase this to 10,000. That's how it spawns only at the very top. But you'll notice that the transition between our normal grass landscape and the snow is a little bit too sharp. If we want to increase that transition or the fall off, then we will activate top material fall off and change this from 1500 to 10,000, which will give it a smoother transition. Now our landscape has snow at the very top of the mountain. And let's say if we do have a location at the top of the mountain where I don't want snow to spawn, then I could jump back into landscape editing mode. And down here we have the material layer, no height map. So let's create a layer info for this, and make sure when you're creating this, instead of selecting weight blended layer, which is what we would normally select for materials, we select non-weight blended layer. Create that. And now if I select this, bring up the tool strength, go into paint right here, I can paint away the snow if I don't want it at an area. So even though we are assigning layers within the material parameter, I still have control over where I want that to be. Now let's go leave landscape editing mode, go back into the material parameter, and deactivate top material. So that is all the major parameters for this landscape material. So with all that knowledge, you can go ahead and start creating your own landscapes very quickly with these simple settings. Now that we know how to use the landscape material, let's go over how to get material textures to fill up landscape layers. Luckily for us, we have Megascans, which is a free library of thousands of textures we can use immediately in our landscape. To get Megascan materials is pretty easy. You just want to click on the plus button and then select Quixel Bridge. Now in the future, Quixel Bridge will be called Fab. So you want to select Fab instead of Quixel Bridge. And then we could go to surfaces, and we have all these different surfaces we can use for the landscape. Now in my case, I think I want a sand texture. So I'll type in sand, and then I can find a nice texture that I want to use. For example, this one right here, dry sand, and then download it. So right now it's downloading with medium quality, which is 2K, low quality is 1K, high quality is 4K, and highest quality is 8K. So do keep that in mind when you're selecting the different qualities. Now this is downloaded, I'll press add, and here we get our 2K textures. Now you notice that there's this VT on this texture. That tells us it's a virtual texture. We don't want that. We want normal textures, which is what the landscape uses. So to switch this back, we could hold down Shift and select all three textures, right click, and go to convert to regular texture, just like that. And then we can save everything. The first two textures are self-explanatory. We have our color, then we have our normal, but this texture right here looks pretty strange. And if I double click to go inside of it, we'll see that it is a weird color. And that's because this texture is actually 3 different masks. So if I uncheck G and B, we have the red channel, which is ambient occlusion. Uncheck red, check green. The green channel is roughness. This is the mask that we want to use for roughness. And then the blue channel is displacement, which we're going to use later for nanites. Now, I don't want the blue channel or the red channel. All I want is green. So we can exit out of that. And now we're going to add my textures to the E layer. And that's because the E layer doesn't have any textures currently assigned to it. So let's go into Content Drawer, Megascans, Surfaces, Dry Sand, which are the textures we just downloaded. And make sure that these 3 are turned on. So of course, the color texture goes into color. The normal texture goes into normal, but you'll see that our roughness is asking for a single mask. This is why down here on all our material layers, we have this mask parameter. So if I turn this on, you'll switch the roughness to a mask. So that's what we want to do. Whenever we have a mask texture, like the ones from Megascans, make sure you have mask turned on right there. And then we could drag in the mask, which will be used for our roughness. Now, if we jump back into the landscape mode, we have the E layer down here. I could create a brand new E layer and start painting it anywhere on my landscape. And we'll see that the texture looks pretty bad right now. I think this is more noticeable if we fly to where the mannequin is right here. So whenever I'm adjusting the sizes of my texture, I like to do that next to a human reference, which makes it easier to know exactly what I have to change. Okay, so I think that the texture could be a little bit bigger. So go to size and bring that down to 0.5. Okay, that is better. And there's also very noticeable tiling. So one thing I can do is activate either cell bomb or distance blending. I'm going to activate cell bombing. And now that tiling has been removed. And this texture is way too bright. So within albedo controls, we could bring down that brightness to, let's go 0.7. Okay, that is great. Now, I want this layer to basically be a sand layer at the very bottom of my landscape. And I could go through within the landscape mode and paint it, or within the material instance, scroll down here to bottom material and turn this on. Okay, so now that will automatically spawn that. And it's spawning it in the middle of the mountain. We don't want that, so go into the bottom material start. And instead of 2,000, change this to negative 17,000. Okay, so now we have a sand material at the very bottom of my landscape. So if I add in water, then we turn this mountain into an island, which goes to show the flexibility of this material. Now it's time to cover the best feature of this material, and that is Nanite displacement, which is brand new in UE5. It gives us the ability to add extra geometry that deforms to the layers. Basically, we get near infinite detail, and because it is Nanite, there is very little performance cost to using it. I made setting up Nanite super easy on the landscape, so let's go over how to use it. In the downloadable project, I added an example of how to use Nanite landscapes. So we go to example, maps, and we've been on the mountain map this entire time. Instead, we're going to open up the Nanite examples map. And this is what you will see when you go into the Nanite examples map. And that is, if I come up to these rocks, they are real geometry. They're not being faked with normal maps or parallax occlusions. This is geometry that exists in the world. And this is incredible that we can get this amount of detail on landscapes, because normally landscapes are not this detailed. We even get geometry on cliffs. So you see that they're real three-dimensional cliffs. Or if I come over here, this is a good showcase of Nanite displacement. If I move the light around, you can see the landscape casting shadows onto itself, which looks insanely cool. So Nanite landscapes opens up a whole bunch of options that weren't possible beforehand. This basically means we have near infinite detail for our landscape, and we don't have to rely that much on foliage or static meshes to detail our landscapes. We can have the displacement maps of the textures do most of the heavy lifting. Now, how do we get Nanite landscapes with displacement? So number one, if I open up this material instance, scroll all the way down, we'll see that this parent isn't m_landscape. Instead, it's m_landscape height. So landscape height is the exact same as our basic landscape, except this one adds height blending and displacement. And if you ever want to convert a basic landscape to landscape height, then within your basic landscape, select height right here to convert it. And all the parameters will be carried over because, as you can see, it is the same. The only new parameters are right here. We have height blending parameters, and then we also have displacement mapping, which is being handled right there. Now, the other thing you have to do, besides using the correct material, is to make sure your landscape is using Nanite. So all the way down here, you want to select Enable Nanite, and then press Build Data. And we can double check that this environment is using Nanite by now going to Nanite Visualization and Triangles. As you can see, it's updating in real time. Now, as of Unreal Engine 5.3, Nanite landscapes only work for small landscapes, like this one. If you try to use it on the mountain, it won't work. Of course, that will change in the future. And nanite displacement is disabled by default because displacement is still experimental. You will not have this issue if you're on Unreal Engine 5.4 or future versions of Unreal. For everyone on Unreal Engine 5.3, to enable nanite displacement, go into m underscore landscape height, and down here you'll see for UE 5.3, add to default engine.ini, render settings, these two console commands. So highlight r.nanite allow tessellation equal 1 and r.nanite.tessellation equal 1. So make sure you have those copied. And then within the project folder, we'll have this folder called config. Double click to go inside of it. And then we need to go into default engine. You can use any text editor. I'm just going to use Notepad. And within here, under script engine renderer settings, you want to make sure you paste in these two values. So I already have the values pasted in. If you don't have those values, then you can copy them anywhere within this list, but make sure that it is under renderer settings. And then after you do that, make sure you save the default engine and restart Unreal Engine. And then you're going to get nanite displacement. So again, that's only for Unreal Engine 5.3 because this is experimental. In the future, you won't have that issue. Now let's go over what the new parameter settings are. So first off, for our mask parameter, if we uncheck this, so we're no longer using mask, we now have two different textures. So we still have our original roughness texture, but we can ask for an individual height texture. So if I double click on this, this is what the height texture will look like when it's not baked into a mask. So all the white parts of the texture will be elevated and the black parts will be lowered. This is very important with height textures, and that is for compression settings, make sure you select HDR compressed. This will give Unreal a lot more data to use when creating the displacements. If you use something different, like default, then you're going to see weird jagged geometry when you zoom into the landscape. So to get rid of that, select HDR compressed, which will be a more accurate height map. Now in our case, I'm going to turn on mask because the height texture is stored in the mask. Since this is a Megascan texture, height is always stored in the B channel. The other new parameters are height, blend, offset, power, and strength. We will go over those in just a second because I want to cover displacement first down here underneath cell bombing. So all our layers get displacement. And of course, the first is a toggle on and off. So if I toggle this off, then we don't have any displacement. And then if I turn it on, of course, we get displacement and all the options that it comes with. So let me go ahead and let's reset them to their default values. And we will start off with strength. So strength is how strong you want the displacement to be, of course. So if we want this to be 2 times what it is right there, then we just type in 2. And now our displacement is looking a little bit interesting, and it's actually flat at the top right here. And that's because there's a limit to how far we can add displacements. So if I do 2, you'll see that it is hitting the limit. So if I bring this to 1.5, actually let's go 1.2, then it is a little bit stronger than beforehand. And you notice that I had to move the camera back and forward in order to update the shadow maps. That is a glitch with Unreal Engine 5.3. You will not have that issue in the future. So keep that in mind when I move the camera back and forward. That's just to update the shadows. And then we have contrast, which controls the displacement's contrast. So if I bring this up to 1.5, then we get much sharper displacements. So now the rocks are really coming out of the ground and they're a lot more noticeable. So if I bring this down to something like 0.7, then it will smooth out the displacement. So that's not as harsh. So you can think of contrast right here as displacement smoothness. And then we have a displacement offset. So displacement offset is how far up or how far down this entire layer as a whole will be compared to other materials. So right here we have the grass material. And then if I bring down the displacement offset to -1, and then if I move back and forward, you'll see that now the rocky layer is below the height of the grass and is below the height of other layers like right here. And then if I bring this up to +1, now this rocky layer is way above the height of the other layers. The reason why this is an option is because whenever we're playing with the strength or contrast, it can adjust the entire height of the layer. So by adding in the offset, we could bring the height back down or back up to the same level as the other layers. And finally, let's say you really like the values of your strength and contrast, but you want to bring down the displacement as a whole without messing up these values, then that's what the displacement amount slider is for. So right now it's at 1, so it's full displacement. But then if I want a little bit less, I can bring it down to 0.5. So this is half of what the displacement was. Or just bring it down all the way to 0. So now there is no displacement. So let me go leave it at 0.8 for now. And those are all the parameters for displacement. And those parameters are exactly the same, of course, for each layer. For example, with the D material layer, I noticed that compared to other layers like the grass layer, this is lowered way too much. So to fix this, we go to the D material, then all the way down here to displacement. And for the displacement offset, I could try to bring this up to, let's do 0.5, and immediately that fixed it. Or if I want to add a little bit more displacement, I can increase this to 1 to make the geometry pop more. I'm back in the original example project because it's easier to show exactly what the height blend parameters do. Because if you remember, we skipped over them to talk about displacement. And for the most part, the height blend parameters are pretty similar to displacement, except they don't affect displacement. Instead, they affect how the different landscape layers are blended in with each other. Because now that we're using a height texture, we want to use this height texture to affect the different blends. So when we are transitioning between two materials, for example, the rocky material and the grass material, it is more realistic to make the rocks appear first before it transitions all the way over to the rocky ground. So you notice that right here, we have grass, and then we see the rocks first. They're coming out of the ground, and then we transition to the full layer. It makes the landscape just a little bit more realistic, and that is controlled right here. So for example, let's say if I don't want that transition to be that noticeable, instead of 1.3, we could set that to 1. And now those rocks are a little bit less, or I could just set this to 0, and we don't get any of that transition between the rocks and the grass. This is the kind of transition we would get on the basic landscape material with no height map. So if I bring this up to 1, then we get a little bit more rocks, or I can increase the blend power and also increase the strength at the same time to make that transition more noticeable. So if I go into the landscape layer, and let me go decrease my brush, go to paint, and select the rock layer, which is D, decrease that tool strength size. If I just make light touches, we start to get the rocks first. So just very light touches, we get a little bit of rocks until we start to get the actual material. So this is a nice way to get a realistic blend between the different material layers. So you can adjust the height blend for all the layers until you get something that you like. And then you could go through the world and add rocks without it completely transitioning to the main layer. So that is what the height blend parameters are for. That is how we can use nanites with the landscape. Another new feature added in UE5 is landscape patches, which will let us use height textures to deform the entire landscape. With patches, we could quickly add a lot of height detail to the landscape without having to sculpt it. To see the height patches, you can jump into the patch example map. So go to example maps and double click to go inside of it. So these are the height patches that this pack comes with. And height patches are great because they allow us to quickly get in height detail from textures and the ability to move around that height detail like it's a 3D object. So it's really fun to manipulate your landscape this fast. And we could even scale it down or scale it up, make it really big to encompass the entire landscape, or make it super small, so it's only in a portion of that landscape. And all the detail within this map is handled exclusively by patches, so there is no sculpting whatsoever. Let's go over how to add patches to a brand new project, specifically this environment that we created in the starter course. So first things first, you need to make sure that the proper plugins are enabled. So go to settings, plugins, and type in landmass. Make sure landmass is turned on, and also make sure landscape patch is turned on. Now it is beta, so you are probably going to encounter some glitches. Of course, in future versions, this will not be in beta. Now we have two landscapes. We have this main one right here, but then we also have this landscape. So we will add patches to this one, and you will have to migrate the landscape folder into this project. I've already migrated that folder, and the patches will be under landscape patches. The patch will be bb_landscape patch, and drag that out to let go. It will ask us if we want to insert a new landscape edit layer, press accept. And that will create, if I go into landscape mode, a new layer right here called landscape patches. So if I select layer, I'm still able to sculpt like normal. The landscape patches are going to be added on top of our sculpts, which means it is non-destructive. Don't worry, the patches are not going to erase any of the hard work you have already done on the landscape. Another thing that was created, if we go into the outliner and type in patch, is this landscape patch manager, which will handle all the patches. Make sure you do not delete this actor, because if you do, your patches will break. You also want to make sure that the correct landscape you want to put the patches on is selected. So in my case, it's selecting landscape 2, which is this landscape, which is where the patches should go. Now, for some reason, it did not create the patch when I dragged it in, so I'm going to have to drag it in again and then let go. And also press the G key to turn off game view mode so I can see my widget. So here's our patch. Right now it's not doing anything, and that's because I have to assign it a texture. Now, I can't just go over to the details panel and start messing with the patch settings. I have to select landscape texture patch component right here within the components tab. So make sure this is selected, and then we get access to all the settings we need. So specifically, I'm going to go down to source mode, select texture asset, and we're going to place one of these textures right here. So I'll select land mountain 2 and then let go. And immediately this is making effect. Now, before I move this patch around or before I scale it or rotate it, I need to make sure that I have bp_landscape patch selected. Because otherwise, if I have this component selected and then if I move it around, then you'll see that the patch is in a different location from the blueprints. So don't worry, if you do that, nothing will break. That is perfectly fine, but it'll just make it harder for us, the developers. So before I move my patch, I make sure I have this component selected. Now I can move this patch around, then I can scale it up so we can actually see this mountain, move it off to the side, and then scale it down. That's how it just makes a slight effect on the landscape. And just like any other object in Unreal, I can duplicate this patch by holding down Alt and dragging, and we get another patch. So I'm going to change the texture on this patch. So let's go back to the landscape texture patch to get the settings. And instead of the mountain, I will use this erosion height texture and place it right there. So I like this one because I can basically make a valley right here. So just scale this up, scale that down, and then make it so it encompasses this entire landscape. Now you will notice that the patch is now cutting into the other patch. So in case you don't want that, then within the settings right here, scroll up to blend mode and select max. So this will make it so that the patches are better blending in with each other. Another change that I can make is that you'll notice when I lift up this patch, it lifts up the entire landscape. So in case we don't want that to happen, come down here under 0 height meaning and change this from patch Z to landscape Z. So that'll prevent the patch from elevating the entire landscape. And if I select away from the patches, if I ever want to select them back, it can be really hard to find the origin point of the blueprint. Then I could come up to the outliner, type in patch, and then select the patches right here. That is an easier way to select the patch. I have this patch. I'm going to make it really large, but before I do, let's go back into the texture patch settings and change this to max. And we're going to select the blueprint root of the patch and then just scale it up to make it pretty large. And something cool about landscape patches is that if I go in with the foliage mode and start painting a bunch of trees, then if I jump back into the patch and I scale this up, the trees will remain on top of it. So it is a very non-destructive way to edit your landscapes. And of course, you're not just limited to the height textures that are included in this pack. Feel free to download any height textures online or use height textures from other Unreal Marketplace assets to add to the patch. My favorite feature besides Nanite is virtual texture blending. Virtual texture blending has been around for a while, and I pretty much use it on all of my environments. It allows us to seamlessly blend objects with the landscape. It is best to show why it is great with an example. So let's jump into the texture blending map. And this is what we will see. It's just a basic small landscape. And in the middle, we have some rocks. But what's unique about these rocks is that they are blending with the landscape. To see what the rocks would look like without texture blending, we can open up the material. And then within the details panel, scroll all the way down here and we have virtual textures. If I turn that off, then this is what the rocks would look like if they're just placed on the landscape. And obviously this doesn't look realistic. We have a grass texture and then all of a sudden it just transitions to rock. Normally you would expect grass to grow on top of the rock or there be a slight transition. And this is where virtual textures come in handy. They allow us to get that transition. So before I jump into how we set up virtual textures, because it is a process, let me go over the different settings we have right here. So the first setting is the fall off. If I want the transition to be longer, then we can increase that to 200. So now more of the grass is on top of the rock, or if I want there to be a sharp transition, we can lower that to something like 10. So it's only a slight transition. And of course we have virtual blend height, which will increase the height at which that transition starts. So we can play with the height and then we can play with the fall off. We also have remove sides. The reason why this is an option is because if I uncheck it, then the grass would grow on the side like right here, but it gives a really nasty texture stretching. So by turning this on, it will just remove it from sharp angles. So we don't have that stretching. And then we also have a noise texture, which will add a little bit of noise to the fall off. That's how the transition between the meshes texture and the ground texture isn't that obvious. Because in reality, the transition wouldn't be a smooth fall off. You would expect to see little splotches of the landscape on top of the rocks. And that is exactly what the noise texture will give us. Now I removed the virtual texture to show how we would set it up. And do keep in mind that this is a process. So first off, you want to make sure that your project supports virtual textures. So go into project settings, scroll down here until we get to rendering right there. And then make sure enable virtual texture support is turned on. Once it's turned on, you want to create two virtual textures. So I'm just going to create it here within this folder, right click, go down to textures and select runtime virtual texture. Call this RVT_height. And then copy this, Control C, Control V, and call this one RVT_material. So the height of my landscape will be stored in the height, and then the material of the landscape will be stored in the material. And we need to jump into the height texture and change it to height. So change it to world height. And then for RVT_matte, we can leave it as base color, normal, roughness, specular. So all four of these channels will be stored within this runtime virtual texture, which is exactly what we need for a landscape. Now that we have our two virtual textures, we need to tell Unreal the area that those virtual textures will cover. And to do that, we need to come up to the add button, go to volumes, and then add in a runtime virtual texture volume at the very last one right there and drop it into the world. Press G, that's how we're actually able to see it. Okay, here it is. And we're gonna scale this up. That's how it encompasses the entire area that I want captured. Now, instead of scaling up, I will have Unreal do it automatically. But before we can have Unreal do it automatically, we need to first assign it a virtual texture. So let's first do the height. So drag height right there. And now that I've assigned it, I can select a landscape. So select the picker icon and select the landscape and then press set bounds. This will automatically scale the bounds. That's how it encompasses the entire landscape. Now, in my opinion, I want to make this height taller, just in case if I go in with a sculpt brush and I sculpt above the bounds, then that means our virtual texture is no longer capturing that part of the landscape. So to make it taller within scale, instead of 1300, Let's make this 10,000. Okay, that's better. Now what I will do is Control C and Control V this. So we're duplicating it. That's why we have another bounds on top of the previous one. And this one, instead of capturing the height, we will capture the material. And notice how both these virtual textures are black. That means it's not capturing the landscape just yet, because I have to tell the landscape, hey, these two virtual textures are trying to capture you. I know there is a lot we have to do to set this up, but trust me, it is worth it. So select the landscape, scroll all the way down till we get to virtual textures. We need to add in two, so press the add button twice, and it will be the two virtual textures we already have. So height and material. And now if I save it, we can see in the previews that it is capturing the landscape. So now that our runtime virtual textures contain our landscape data, we need to put this landscape data on top of any meshes we want to blend with the landscape. And by default, most materials aren't blending with virtual textures. So let's go ahead and let's open up this rock material, which is the default Megascans material instance. We need to open up its master material all the way down here. And this is what Megascans will give you for your basic assets. Now I want to add on at the very end of this material graph a function that will overlay the virtual textures on top of this material. And luckily for you, I've already created that. If we go into landscape material functions, it is mf_vt blend. So just go ahead and drag that in, and it is asking for a material attribute, which is good because that's exactly what this line is. So all I have to do is plug it up like this, and that is it. Now, in case your material looks like this, which is the material we created from the starter course, what you want to do is right click and go make material attributes. And then you're going to hold down control and then drag those lines into the make material attribute. So go metallic to metallic, roughness to roughness, and normal to normal right there. And now the output will be a material attribute. So within these settings for this material, select use material attributes, and then we can hook it up right there. And this just gives us the ability to add in the mf_vt blend right here like this to allow this material to blend with the landscape. Once we add in that blend, it will give us a new option within the material parameters down here called virtual textures. So we can just enable them right here by pressing that button. Now the mesh will turn black. Don't worry, that's just because we need to put the virtual textures we created right there. So let's go to where the virtual textures are, drag height into heights, and the landscape into landscape. And there we go. Now we have a working blending object. So that is the process to enable virtual textures. I know it is a lot, but it is worth it. I used it heavily in this creek build. So if I hide the foliage, we can see that all the static meshes, especially the natural static meshes, are blending in with the environment. It looks very natural for these meshes to be here. And then as soon as I turn off virtual textures, all of a sudden these assets look really out of place. It is noticeable that I'm just plopping down different objects that aren't related to each other. So virtual textures really allows realistic asset placement that blends with the environment, which could turn an environment from looking like this to this. And finally, the last feature is procedural foliage. It gives us the ability to dynamically add objects on each of our layers so we don't have to use the foliage tool or manually place them. So our grass layer can spawn grass and our cliff layers will spawn rocks automatically. To show off the landscape procedural foliage tool, I am back in the creek world and I got rid of the law of the small objects. So there's no grass, flowers, ferns, or pebbles. Instead, all of that will be handled by the landscape. And you might be wondering why I also didn't get rid of the trees, and that's because trees should still be handled by your traditional foliage placement. Since the assets placed by landscape do not have collision, and also the way it works is that it spawns in assets that are close to the player. So if we have grass that is all the way over here, it won't be spawned in. And we want to see trees everywhere. And if trees are being handled by the landscape, then it's going to be noticeable when they're spawned. This procedural foliage tool should only be used for really small assets like grass, ferns, and pebbles. To start adding the foliage assets, if we go into the landscape folder, which is the folder that we migrate into all of our projects, and then go into materials, we have this folder called landscape grass. And it is here where we define what objects should spawn based on the layer. So our grass right now is layer A. So I could double click on this to get the layer A procedural foliage. For example, if I want to spawn ferns on my grass, then I can press on the plus button, and within the drop down, let's select fern. And we also get a bunch of other settings. Feel free to play with them and see which settings you like. Really, the most important setting is the grass density, which controls how many assets are spawned. So now that we have this selected, if I move this off to the side, you notice that there are no ferns. And that's because within the auto material, under foliage, you need to make sure material A is turned on, and then press the on button right there. And now we get a bunch of fern everywhere. And honestly, this is too many ferns. So we can bring that down right here to, let's try 10. Okay, that looks like a better amount. And if I want to vary the size of these ferns, that's how some ferns are small and others are larger. Then down here, we can make small ferns. Let's go 0.7 for smaller. And then the largest ones could be something like 2. So we get really small ones and we get really large ones. Also, the reason why I have this mannequin in here is to make sure that the sizes of the foliage make sense. So in this case, it doesn't really. So let's bring that down to 1.25. Okay, that looks a little bit better. And of course, we need grass on this landscape. So let's go ahead and add in another one by clicking the plus button again. And then down here, we will select grass clump. And now we have a bunch of grass everywhere. And this is all spawned automatically. And you'll notice that this is only being spawned on the grass layer. It's not being spawned on this layer, or it's not spawning in the middle of a pond, which is using this pebble layer. And this is all dynamic. So I notice that the grass is going into the water. That's not supposed to happen. So by jumping into paint mode, I'm able to paint away that grass by painting in the pebble layer, just like this. And it is all highly dynamic. And each of these layers can have their own set of spawnable meshes. I went on to fill out some of the other layers, and I also added more meshes to grass. So now we have a little bit of rock spawning with grass, also dead brush, and different variations of the grass that are spawning. And if we come over here, you'll see that for the sea layer, we have rocks and twigs spawning. So each layer has their own set of meshes being spawned. And let's say we don't want foliage being spawned at a specific place, like this road, which is currently being covered. Then we can go into landscape mode, paint, and down here we have foliage remover. So let's create this layer by clicking on the plus button and make sure you select non-weight blended layer instead of weight blended layer normal, which is what we would use for the other layers. So select non-weight blended layer, save that there. And now in order to get back my path, that's how there isn't grass and rocks in the way of where people would normally walk. I could paint it down and now get rid of that. Actually, let me go increase my tool strength and also increase the size. So now I'm painting away that foliage to make room for where people walk. And if I ever paint away too much foliage, to get it back, hold down Shift and then start painting to bring back that procedural foliage. So this is a really cool way to get a bunch of meshes onto your landscape without having to use the foliage tool or manually placing it. Oftentimes when creating a landscape, you want the foliage to be the same across the world and also different for each layer. This is an easy and quick way to do it automatically. This tutorial only covers how to use the landscape material, not how to create it from scratch. If you want to unlock the full potential of Unreal, then you could check out the Unreal Masterclass, which is a collection of exclusive courses I made for UE5. There's an advanced material course in it where we build the landscape material from the ground up. If you want to take your Unreal skills to the next level, check out the Masterclass, link in the description. That is how you use this landscape material. It makes the process of creating environments a lot easier, and it is a lot faster than creating your landscape material completely from scratch. Have fun with it, and I will see you in the next video.